So last week in the Sacred Gathering, we had a discussion that I thought was great around just money and how it often represents, protection or freedom, or influence or value, whatever. We also talked some about some of the other things that we might try to seek out, whether it's actual money or other kinds of social currency or influence. Again, to seek out those things which make us feel safe or that we actually need in life, right? We kind of ultimately, I think, came to the conclusion that only God can provide those things, that everything else, money included, that we're going to try to rely on to protect ourselves from the world is ultimately going to come up empty. It's interesting because we looked at one of the epistles. So it's a letter, it's very practical. This week we're swinging in almost the exact opposite direction. We're going to be looking at a couple of sections out of the book of Lamentations. So it's poetry, it's very visceral, pathological, compared to the kind of simple advice. And yet I actually think there's an interesting connection in that what has happened, why the book of Lamentations is being written, is because they have relied on something that has ultimately failed them, right? They have relied on other gods, they've relied on idols to provide for them, they've relied on their own kind of political savvy in a vicious and horrible political time, and they have lost everything. And so this idea of us trusting the wrong thing has some real teeth to it. It has some real stakes even in the modern world, and I think it makes for an interesting contrast. Just this place of pain and warning when we do not trust God, when we trust those other things, which at times we might be tempted to think, not such a big deal. We'll tell that to the people who wrote the Lamentations. It's a big deal. This can end in true horror and true tragedy, right? So the book of Lamentations is a poetic response to this absolutely horrific event in ancient Israel where they have lost everything. They have provoked the biggest, baddest empire at the time. They have been completely sacked as a city, and so there's destruction just in the physical sense. The walls of their city have been torn down. Many people have been slaughtered. The place has been looted. The place has been burned. They have also kind of culturally lost kind of their future, because the Babylonian and several of the other empires' policy at the time was to relocate people. And so they take everyone, they take the best and the brightest, the future in many ways, the cultural elites, the most educated, the future leaders, and they take them across the desert. They make them live in Babylon. So they are completely gone. And then it's this theological devastation as well, right? The story of God moving in history, of freeing slaves, of making his home among people, eventually in this building that is the temple. This is supposed to represent kind of the foothold of God's kingdom on earth. They're supposed to be a bunch of priests inviting the rest of the world into God's way of doing things. And so the question is, if this has been burned to the ground, it's been completely and utterly destroyed by people who value power instead of kind of God's way of doing things in the world, what does this mean for the plan? What does this mean? And so this complete and utter devastation is written into this book we now call Lamentations. In the Hebrew, it's interesting. The title for Hebrew books usually comes from like the first word or the first sentence, and the word that is used for Lamentations, which comes from the Greek or the Latin for lament, for feeling sad, right? But the Hebrew title isn't even a word really. It's this like just this like almost visceral scream. It's just like that they have this way that we can't really translate very well. And that's how they start this book, is just this kind of sigh, this ache, this visceral scream. And that's where it comes from. And so it's a very dark book. It's a very visceral book in a lot of ways. And yet it's not an accidental book. It's a book that was written in a very kind of strict poetry form. It's called an acrostic. It's kind of like an A to Z, so the lines would start with each letter. So it's very well thought out. It's not just like I'm mad and frustrated and bleh. Here's the thing. It's slowed down. It's thought through. The book itself was likely kind of a series of poems originally. It feels like they're written different in enough different meter and a different style enough that it's a little bit of a collection. And it's written in a very interesting way. We, as kind of Western people who have kind of grown up around the idea of logic, we tend to like things to be structured towards kind of a conclusion toward the end. So the most important stuff is the end, right? We argue our points and then we get down to, and then we end on the main point. In the Hebrew Bible, they like to do what's called a chiasm a lot of the time, in which they would have the main point often embedded very in the middle. And so the idea, the image a lot of the time is kind of circling around, spiraling around, working your way to the center. And then when you've made your main point, you kind of work your way back out through the labyrinth or through the maze, whatever, revisiting a lot of these same ideas, thoughts, images, and working your way back out. And so this book does this. And so it starts out and it ends in really dark places of chaos and pain. And yet at the center is a very brief and light glimmer of hope, which is actually, I would argue, the center point. Not that the circumstances would give us any hope, but at the very center of the book of Lamentations, there is a trust in who God is, despite the circumstances, despite the absolute devastation. And this book is important, I think, for just telling the story of what it is that God is up to in the world. And so this is a book, whether it was intentionally written this way or not, that works pretty well for being recited out loud. And to this day, many Jewish communities are going to recite this kind of collectively out loud. They'll recite this poem or these series of poems together to tell the fact that devastation and sorrow and injustice are very much a part of the world. It's very much a part of our story, in which we have to kind of defy circumstances with hope in who God is and what God is doing in the world. And so it's a very important part of our story, one that we often want to skip past, get to the kind of happy ending. But it's an important part of telling kind of God's story among people, etc. So I'll stop talking about Lamentations, read a few examples. Again, they're very much worth your time. It takes, I think, under an hour to read them. So if you have time, read the whole thing this week. Again, looking for this middle section we're going to look at, which is kind of the kernel of hope, which is actually the main point of the entire cycle of poems, in my opinion. We're also going to look at a section out of chapter 1, which I think exemplifies really well. This is right at the beginning of the book and exemplifies kind of the despair that they are in very well. So I'm going to read out of Lamentations chapter 1 and a few verses out of Lamentations chapter 3, which is almost always included in lectionary readings, just because I think it's such an important point for the book overall. How she sits alone, the city once great with people, has become like a widow. Great among nations, mistress among provinces, reduced to forced labor. She weeps on through the night, and her tears are on her cheek. She has no consoler from all her lovers. All her friends have betrayed her, have become enemies to her. Judah is exiled in affliction and in hard labor. She dwells among the nations. She finds no rest. All her pursuers overtake her in straits. The roads of Zion mourn without festival pilgrims. All her gates are desolate, her priests are groaning, her virgins are sorrow-stricken, and she, it's bitter for her. Her foes are at the head, her enemies are tranquil. For the Lord has stricken her with sorrow because of all her trespasses. Her babes have fallen captive before the foe, and from Zion's daughter is departed all her glory. Her nobles have become like stags that find no pasture, and they go without strength before the pursuer. And so we get a couple more chapters of that kind of stuff, of just the meditating, the picking through the pieces of this devastation. And the one little glimmer of hope that sits at the very center of this darkness. And I don't want to skip to that, because there is a lot of gloom, a lot of devastation in this book. But at the very center, this is what we get. Recall my affliction and my wanderings, wormwood and poison. My very life does recall and bends down upon me. And thus I answer in my heart, therefore I yet have hope. The Lord's kindness has not ended, for his mercies are not exhausted. They are renewed every morning. Great is your faithfulness. My portion is the Lord, I said. Therefore I yet hope for him. Good is the Lord for those who look to him, for the person who seeks him out. Good that he hopes in silence for rescue from the Lord. And then the poem continues, and the devastation continues, and it falls back apart. So the first chapter that I read is going to do something that the book of Lamentations does a lot, actually, and that is personify both the city and people in pain as women. It recognizes that this image of a widow, of a woman who has lost her husband, is there in mourning, and the loss is and who's lost her children is going to be another piece of the image, is a really important one. One, just because the mourning and the loss, of course, representing the husband is God, is God's presence, right? But also in that time, in that culture, a widow, someone who did not have a man to advocate for her, to make sure things were fair, to work for her, whether it's a husband or a son. And this woman, Jerusalem, has lost both. And so this is someone who is not just in pain and in mourning and experiencing loss. It is someone who will continue to be vulnerable, as the city very literally will, as its walls and gates have been torn down, as its cultural center of the temple has been burned to the ground. They will continue to remain a vulnerable people who have lost all the protection that they were expecting from either these other gods or from their own political, military might, right? They are vulnerable. They're exposed is another word that is used a lot of the time. And the hard thing about this is they can't even claim that this is just wild injustice, that the world is not fair, because this poem recognizes that this is in many ways maybe not what they deserve, but these are the consequences of the poor choices they've been making for a while. If we're using this kind of woman as a widow image, it also points out that this is a woman who's had affairs. She's had other lovers. She's trusted and expected others to come through for her, driving away her own husband, driving away God's presence, and yet none of them have come through. And I think that's that connection with what we were talking about. What is it we're trusting in so much of the time? Is it money? Is it our influence? Is it the right people in our lives? Is it education, etc.? All of these things are going to disappoint us unless they are God. All of these things are going to ultimately end up empty and driving God away because we trust in them rather than him. And this place of destruction, this place of devastation, is where we are going to find ourselves in the world if we are not careful. And yet, in the center of this poem, we get that section from chapter 3 as well, right? And it starts out with just the assumption that, okay, yes, this is my fault. Yes, we may in some way, shape, or form deserve this, though, of course, there will be condemnation for how utterly over the top and vicious this people were in conquering Israel, and how terrible the Babylonians were. And yet, right from the get-go at chapter 3, at this very center, this kernel, it just kind of points out, God, do you see this? Do you see what has been done? Do you remember our affliction, our wanderings, wormwood and poison? I love that. Bitterness, just death. They just spit it out. They don't even know what to do with it. This is what my experience is. It's just gross bitterness. It's poisonous. It's caustic. It burns, whatever imagery you want to use there. But they're assuming that God cares. They're assuming that God wanted to be near his people, who are pretty unimpressive from the first place, right? They're assuming God sees and is not washing his hand of them. They are assuming who God is despite all the circumstances. And this is what gives them hope, right? They say, my hope is not based on any changed circumstances. The book of Lamentations stays raw till the very end. God does not fix everything. Now we get to praise him like, oh, okay, yeah, it all makes sense now, right? The hope is not based on a changed heart or a deserving response. Is there mourning over this? Yes. But we can clean it up at times too, right? Saying, well, when someone fully repents, when someone has totally changed their ways, then we'll talk. That is not what it's saying. It's saying here, like, this is my experience. This is my pain. My hope does not come from the fact I now deserve it when I didn't used to. I've changed. Now I'm worthy of you showing up, right? It's not based on anything except who God is. It tells us in here who they think God is. The Lord's kindness is not exhausted. God is kind. God is merciful. Again, not expecting someone to deserve it or to get around to hitting a certain point morally and then God will pay attention. God's mercy isn't exhausted. He will never pour it all out, right? They are renewed every morning, and great is your faithfulness. And this is going to be a really important term because, again, they're abandoned by God because they broke faith with God. They did not follow through with their part of the bargain, as we often do not. Their hope is not based on their faithfulness or any kind of obligation on God's part. Their hope is based on God's faithfulness being strong enough to overcome their unfaithfulness. God is not going to run out in those things. And it's a fascinating place that they come to, not just that because they know who God is, they trust that God is going to fix things and give them back their city. He's not going to give them back the circumstance. He's not going to undo what they've experienced. They come to the place humbly of simply saying, my portion, all I need in this situation is you again. And those other things, I suspect, are going to flow from that because they know who God is. He is merciful. God is desiring of healing. God, it says many times, He desires His people to be blessed and to thrive and to have the fullness of those things. And God is not a means to an end, right? As we so often treat Him. What I really want is blessedness and comfort. What I really want is prestige. And that's where we turn to money. That's where we turn to those other things. And this person, in this brief moment, this glimmer of hope that they have, is saying, I suspect if God is my portion, He'll give me enough. He'll be enough. He will offer those things out, and comfort won't be the ultimate end. God will be the ultimate end. He will be my portion. He will be enough. He will provide those other things on the scale and in the ways we trust. This is a difficult place to be. Most of us cannot get here without some kind of a devastation of trusting God because we simply have to and because nothing else has come through. And that is where our hope comes from. That is where our confession of this is who we say God is. This is the life that we are living. This is how we move forward. And so this being part of Scripture, this being something we recite, this being, I think, a correct response to so many pains and experiences in the world, right? We have looked to other things to protect ourselves and those we care about and the things we care about, and they will ultimately fail us. This is a part of the Christian story. And no matter what circumstances look like, we can trust God's faithfulness, even when it's our own damn fault that we are miserable and we trusted the wrong things. We can trust who God is. His mercy, His faithfulness are not going to run out. And when we come to the place where they say, all those other things are gone, all those other comforts, all those other things I trusted to protect me, you can and will be enough. That's why we have hope. We have hope that God is enough and can provide those other things from the goodness of His heart. But we have to trust on His timing. We have to trust on His way of being in those places. And that is hard. That is hard when we feel like simply screaming, basing on the unfairness and the pain of the place we are in. But this is a huge part of the story. The story, as much as we try to tell it, that if you do this, everything is going to work out for you. That is a lie. The world we live in is deeply broken, and people hurt one another. And God does not let that define things. He can be our portion. He can be enough in spite of any and all circumstances. That is our message. That is why we have hope, because we know who God is, that He is faithful and trustworthiness beyond any and all circumstances. Amen?